But first, I wanted to focus on an issue that we did not really get to talk about since it sprung up. It was about a couple weeks ago. I wasn't really on the show too much last week, but I wanted to speak to the demonstration that was organized here locally by Uplift, and also some of the issues that they had, people trying to kind of interrupt, disrupt. Uh, so this is from an article, Now Kalamazoo. I'm gonna read a little bit from it, and then I'm gonna talk a little bit about more in depth about some of the things that happened there that I was a little, personally, I was a little irked by. Um, and it was basically this again. This protest was a couple weeks ago, like about April 16th. Um, and there were racist taunts and a vehicular assaults. I'm gonna kind of deep dive into that. But again, this was a couple weeks ago in response to the Chauvin trial, and of course the recent rash of police killings. At the time, 13-year-old Adam Toledo had just been killed in Chicago. I'm going to read a little, just some quotes from the organizers. This is from King Ryan, one of Uplift's main organizers. It's unfortunate that the tragedy and trauma that we feel as Black people and we go through has to be shared and so visible. Whenever the national tragedies happen, it is very important that we take that energy and we focus on what we can do locally. Uh, for about 2 hours, more than 100 people rallied around speakers and marched, sometimes with police escort, and blocked roads for safe crossing. That didn't discourage at least one driver from running into the very people demanding protection from the police. And not as much has been made of that. Now Kalamazoo did ask Kalamazoo police if there had been any arrests or an investigation been opened in the incident. Spokesperson did not reply. Time of publication. And I wanted to kind of hone in on that because that is going to lead in to a story that we're about to talk about. This individual basically tried like ramming into some protesters. No one was injured. Some follow-up to that, the Kalamazoo Department of Public Safety decided not to press charges. Neither did the city, even though something that happened on public streets, it would be something in their purview to do. A lot of people are very irritated about that. They did say that the individuals who were affected or who were hit by this vehicle could step forward and press charges. There's some issues with that I'm about to talk about, but the next section that I'm going to be talking a lot about this part of all these bills that is basically trying to legalize ramming protesters. It's basically giving reactionaries a license to kill. And it is critical that people who do this kind of stuff face consequences, because if they do not, it emboldens other individuals to basically ram protesters. And if we all remember last year, a lot of disgusting rhetoric about jokes and memes about running over protests with your cars. These kinds of bills have been going through state legislatures the past 4 years now, especially under the Trump administration. We're seeing a resurgence of that into 2021. It is my hope that people are able to step forward, and this guy doesn't deserve to enjoy being in the city of Kalamazoo, and he should face legal consequences for trying to run people over, trying to commit a vehicular assault. Now, some problems with that, I'm sure some of the people who are affected are maybe concerned about future harassment, doxing, that kind of things. Issues like this tend to get inflated by the conservative reactionary media. And there's also, there are Nazis in our backyard, that are keep track of this kind of stuff and to engage in harassment of individuals who step forward to try to bring consequences to racist dirtbags like this individual who tried to run people over at the Uplift demonstration. I also will say that there's a bit of cowardice on the city's part. I think there is something a little bit deeper going on than just, oh, well, the police are racist and they're not prosecuting this guy, even though they have the ability to do so. I recall something that Nathan Dannison said on our show a few months ago when we were kind of deconstructing the Chicken Boys incident, and also deconstructing how he was booted off the police oversight board for very dubious reasons. And one of the things that he mentioned is that the city is very hesitant to engage in litigation. They're kind of afraid of it. Um, on their end, they're worried about like the financial time sink that could be involved, and also the specter of counter litigation. And a lot of these right-wing reactionary types are very litigious. There's these lawyers that jump at the opportunity to defend um, homicidal, fashy people like this. And the city is probably also just concerned about engaging in that litigation, getting some sort of litigation blowback, getting in a bunch of financial trouble, as it were. Not to say that that's an excuse. I'm trying to say that's kind of like an explanation of like why the city won't step forward and prosecute a guy who, in broad daylight, in the middle of downtown, tried to run people over, and basically leave it up to the people, to the victims of this attack, to step forward and put themselves at a degree of risk. That said, there has to be consequences. Otherwise, this stuff will keep happening. It will embolden other reactionaries to be violent in the future, and that is certainly the last thing that we need. We need some FAPO energy in this town, I guess is what I'm going to say. I'll leave it at that. And that wasn't the only incident there today. There was also some hecklers, people from windows shouting "All lives matter" and derogatory comments. And fortunately, that's not really new. And Also, I found this particularly interesting. Lawrence Winke uh, decided to come with a big sign, basically saying, long way of saying, if you just obey the law and listen to the police, then you'll be fine, and nothing will happen to you. Now, the funny irony of this is, if you don't know Lawrence Winke, he owns greenhouses here in the region, and he's also run for office several times, state rep, as a libertarian. Which we do have some like left libertarians and just regular libertarians who watch our show. And it, like, the funny thing to me is, even amongst most of them, there is an anti-police sentiment. We talk about like Boogaloo Boys that spring a lot from these libertarian movements, and they are anti-police. But it's just this. It speaks to a level of cognitive dissonance and lack of conviction. If you're going to tell people you're a libertarian, don't tread on me. It was like, basically what you're saying is like, oh, please tread on me, or please tread on people that I don't like or I disagree with. If you're a libertarian, you are not supposed to simp for the police state. Certainly not in public with a big old sign. That's one that's kind of a donkey of the day moment, but it's also just that's a local public figure, politician who apparently has no actual political convictions, because that's the whole thing. If you're a libertarian, you're supposed to be against the police state, not make excuses for them and tell people to obey them. Libertarian, you're not supposed to. It's just no ideological convictions there. Lawrence Winke you're dumb dumb. I hope you don't run for libertarian in the future, because I hope some people are going to be calling that out. It's not very libertarian of you at all. To basically say that like, oh yeah, I want freedom from the oppressive government, but if a policeman stops you, or a policewoman or whatever, then they should be able to challenge you to a game of Simon Says, and if you lose or break the rules, they should be able to murder you. No, not at all. So wanted to speak to those important components of some recent protests that happened here in Kalamazoo, and also how that feeds into some more recent news, some really unnerving news of things that we've witnessed across the country over the last couple of weeks. I'm going to go ahead and read from an article from Left Voice. This is kind of the most succinct article I've seen speaking on what's going on. This was published on April 26th, written by B.C. Durrell. Headline is "New Anti-Protest Laws Proliferate Across the United States." And I'm going to read from this, maybe comment here and there. Across the country, new laws are being propagated to chill, curtail, and criminalize protest activities of the type that swept across the country last summer during the massive Black Lives Matter protests. Hold on just a sec, everybody. Um, yeah, all right. In this year's legislative session, state lawmakers have introduced twice as many pieces of legislation limiting the right to protest than in any previous year, and that includes the Trump years, and it's only April. The timing of this tsunami of restrictions is hardly coincidental. Many of these bills were conscious efforts to curtail renewed unrest in the wake of the Derek Chauvin trial, the most high-profile prosecution for police brutality in 3 decades. As police murders continue unabated, we can expect to see a rejuvenation of the movement in the streets that rocked major cities last year. Pro-police lawmakers are moving to install these measures before another uprising takes place. The masses who took to the streets after George Floyd's death have yet to regain the momentum that was so thoroughly smothered by the Democratic Party. Meanwhile, police and the politicians who protect them have learned the lessons of last summer and are moving to legitimize the uses of force necessary to repress another uprising. It is in this context that a raft of draconian state laws have been introduced. Bills in Oklahoma and Iowa seek to indemnify those who plow their cars in the protesters, which we were just talking about, happened here in Kalamazoo, while criminalizing those protesters for occupying public space. The Minnesota and Indiana bills seek to punish protesters by cutting off their access to public benefits or barring them from public office, respectively. Ohio legislators have introduced 3 bills that, according to a local pastor, would have made the protest movement of the 60s illegal. Oklahoma has passed a bill to prevent officers from being doxxed to discourage sharing videos of police brutality online. It's kind of similar to a similar bill that they were trying to pass in France that basically mass protests rose up across the country of France and prevented that. Good abject lesson. Florida, Florida has passed a sweeping anti-rioting pro-law enforcement law that expands protections for police and allows more severe fines and criminal charges to be leveled against protesters. These laws all have clear ties back to the events of last summer, but they seek to legitimize the use of unchecked force in a sweeping, permanent fashion. By codifying the pro-police framing of protest activity into law, these measures seek to legitimize these uses of force that police already resort to in order to curtail protests. The importance of language here cannot be overstated. Florida's law, which Governor DeSantis proudly calls the strongest anti-rioting, pro-law enforcement bill in the country, has been roundly criticized for vagueness of phrasing and definitions, creating uncertainty about how its provisions might be enforced. However, it's clear that this is a feature of the law, not a defect. The bill equates blocking access to public space with violence against property and heightens the penalties for violence against property, expands the definitions of rioting and looting, carves out an entirely new crime called mob intimidation that could easily be used to criminalize protesters for simply shouting at police, and mandates a 6-month minimum jail term for striking an officer during a protest. It creates new and sweeping standards for guilt by association in the context of a protest, such that any person marching in a protest in which property damage occurs can be charged as a looter. And as a final direct slap in the face to the BLM movement, it creates legal penalties for attempting to take down Confederate monuments and curtails the right of local governments to defund their own police forces. This is important to note that actually hasn't happened anywhere in Florida, so you can tell who this bill is made for. It's red meat for the hyper-conservative base. Anyway, criminalizing protests and empowering police repression are 2 sides of the same coin. By expanding legal gray areas and the discretionary use of police force, the opportunities for brutality and repression are greatly expanded, as are the possible avenues of defense in those few instances where use of police force is actually subject to legal challenge. sorry. Conversely, broadening the definition of terms such as rioting, looting, violence, disorder, and threat heightens the risk of engaging in any protest activity. And the definition of what constitutes a peaceful protest is significantly constricted, allowing police to suppress demonstrations with even more flimsy or pretextual justifications. Just as police often claim to have felt threatened as justification for brutalizing or killing black individuals, these laws seek to let police apply that same logic to crack down on organized protests by preemptively labeling them violent or threatening. Sip of my coffee real quick. Beyond Florida, other states' new restrictions are less sweeping, but no less insidious in how they seek to reframe police brutality with pro-cop language. Oklahoma's bill to prevent doxing police officers is a wild inversion of the language of power. Doxing, a term used to describe the victimization of individuals on the internet by bringing their public details to light in order to harass and threaten them, has little relevance to the act of publicizing instances of police brutality. By using that term, lawmakers seek to invert the public perception of such exposés, reframing police as the victims of a theoretical mob rather than as agents of violence themselves. Meanwhile, the police themselves can actually dox the daughter of the mayor of New York, something that happened last year, in retaliation for participating in BLM marches without so much as a slap on the wrist. In Florida, Oklahoma, and Iowa, the explicit protection of people who cause injury and death to protesters by striking them with cars inverts the language of violence even more completely. The driver who drives his car or her car into protesters is given every opportunity to claim fear for their life or property, while the protesters themselves are assumed to be engaged in a form of violence, i.e., the occupation of public property. These laws are direct, antagonistic responses to the maiming of protesters by a vehicle in Tulsa last May and cannot be understood without reference to similar incidents in Aurora, Colorado in June, what happened in Austin, Texas last summer, or the killing of Heather Heyer in 2017. And I just really do want to put a fine point on it. The way these bills are written, and I really don't think enough is being said about this, it is giving people a license to kill. That is literally what it is. It is saying, if you run down protesters, you will not be legally prosecuted. And I don't think we can really stress that enough. I think a lot of us get like outrage fatigue a lot of the time, but like this is basically making it legal to run over protesters and murder them for protesting in the streets on public space. It is really egregious. And, next time somebody tells you that America is a democracy, or even more ridiculous, a great democracy, just they're a clown. They are a clown, and they are clowning themselves because if you didn't think we were living in a police state before, well, there you go. Anyway, the pattern of these incidents give lie to the justification for the laws, which indemnify drivers who simply feel threatened by protesters. Whether the driver's actions are a panicked response, as may have been the case in Tulsa, or a deliberate attempt to cause harm, like what happened in Kalamazoo, as in the other two instances, the language of fear and threat obscures the vastly uneven power dynamic between an unarmed crowd of marchers against a person wielding a multi-ton steel weapon. Again, a vague opposition to violence, in this case the violence of occupying public space and preventing the movement of traffic, is used to justify actual violence against those protesting police brutality. Outside of the Republican legislatures proposing them, condemnation of these laws has been widespread across the political spectrum. Democrats have generally opposed them on grounds of curtailing free speech and the right to assemble, although they do not challenge the implied equation of violence against property with violence against people, or the idea that police have some proper role in monitoring and containing protest movements. Florida law in particular has raised concerns even among centrist and right-leaning circles who worry that its broad and vague language could allow it to be turned against demonstrations of right-wing power, such as the Second Amendment rallies or other conservative political demonstrations. Think of like the free like anti-mask rallies and stuff that were at the Capitol, stuff like that. However, we need not pretend that the law will be blindly applied in such a way that it accidentally criminalizes political activity that aligns with support for police power and private property. we can predict confidently how these new powers will be used in the overwhelming majority of circumstances. Legitimized repression of protests by the economically and politically dispossessed. For example, DeSantis has cited exactly one example of right-wing violence in an effort to make a both sides extremism argument, the January 6th invasion of the U.S. Capitol. Many lawmakers who have specific criticisms of the bill's details have echoed this point to justify their support for it. This is extremely telling, since the January 6th event was very clearly allowed, if not enabled, by police at every level. While these anti-riot and anti-protest laws would dramatically expand the repressive options open to police, this is all for naught if the police choose not to exercise these powers. The idea that expanded police power would have allowed the police to crack down on the January 6th rioters in the same way that they already cracked down on the last summer's BLM protest flies in the face of all evidence and reason. And keep in mind, what happened on January 6th at the Capitol, everything that happened was against the law. There was just no enforcement and no support to actually crack down on the coup d'etat, as it were. Police are acutely aware of the legal limits imposed on their authority and equally conscious of how and when to violate it with impunity. For evidence of this, we need look no further than the complaint record of Derek Chauvin, who has received some publicity even though it is largely excluded from his trial. Long before he killed George Floyd, Chauvin exhibited a long pattern of nearly identical behavior, applying the same kneeling technique with excessive force and brutality. In previous cases, Chauvin evinced a clear knowledge of what went to let up, far beyond what is necessary, but short of where he would face legal troubles. This is why, despite having a rap sheet with 18 complaints of excessive force, Chauvin faced nothing worse than 2 letters of reprimand until he murdered George Floyd on camera. He knew precisely how far he could stray beyond the bounds of legality without risking any serious consequences for himself. This awareness is everywhere in evidence in cases of police brutality. Wherever the legal and societal boundaries are on what level of police violence is acceptable, the police will inevitably push beyond them to the limits of the system's tolerance. It took a brutal and prolonged murder caught on camera and shared widely online to convict even an egregious sadist like Derek Chauvin. These new laws are all the evidence we need that police and the bourgeois politicians who rely on them have no intention of curtailing the day-to-day climate of violence that allowed someone like Chauvin to thrive. In fact, they signal a clear desire to expand those boundaries in direct response to a mass protest movement that threatened the legitimacy of police and the regime of class interests they protect. They are the clearest possible signal that the mass mobilizations of the summer struck fear into the hearts of the upper classes, so we must be ready to continue and broaden those mobilizations. Even as the Republicans attack the right to protest directly, we must not fall into the trap of relying on Democrats' legalist and electoral solutions as the only means of resisting, because these will eventually fall flat in the face of a police force empowered to repress protests by any means necessary. We have to resist not only these harsh restrictions on the act of protesting, but also the fundamentally bourgeois framing that legitimates only peaceful protests that do not threaten private property. This means independence from the two political parties, the two capitalist political parties. Even as it becomes more dangerous legally and physically to engage in protests, it becomes even more important for us to continue to do so. And two other points I really want to stress before we round out that article. While all of these really egregious anti-protest bills are coming largely from the reactionary right, let's also be clear that most of these cities where these protests were going on were run by Democratic administrations. And even as recently as last month, we saw people like the mayor of Portland come out in talking points that sounded very Trumpian, very anti-protest, and were inviting the police state to come in and help crack down on dissent. Here in the city of Kalamazoo, let's not forget the National Guard was called in by a Democratic mayor and a Democratic city commission. And the police abuses that happened last year in our own city happened under Democrats and erstwhile liberals. And, again, the very same city that is refusing to prosecute a vehicular assault is run by those same people who told us, hey, as long as we get Biden in office, everything will be fine. Yeah. Certainly it's up to us to make sure that we come out and protest against these kind of sweeping changes. Again, a good lesson. France, and they tried to pass a similar bills, or I believe it was France or the UK, maybe both, to curtail the ability to people to record police, and people came out in mass demonstrations and prevented that from happening. We need to have that same energy. These reactionary, fascist adjacent dunce heads should not be allowed to curtail our ability to protest. Otherwise, again, we're not really living in a valid democracy. It's kind of a joke to think that we still do if we live in a country where regular people are basically deputized to run down peaceful protesters with their cars. Okay, I think with that, we're going to go ahead and go to a quick break. Y'all are listening to the Hood Rat Strategist radio program only on 89.1 WIDR or online at widerfm.org. You can also find our full episodes on our Facebook page. We upload them after the fact. And please subscribe to our YouTube channel. We chop up our show into shorter segments. You can watch at your leisure. Please subscribe. That way we kind of grow and our videos can go out and get shared with other folks in the Kalamazoo area, kind of trying to keep track of what's really going on. Anyway, y'all listening to the Hood Rat Strategist radio program, your only source for political revolution, and we will be right back.